Okay, so this video is going to be a little different. I'm going to narrate it a little bit here to show you kind of my thought process through doing this job. This is for the people that are trying to learn more about climbing and cutting by yourself when you don't have a crew with you or someone, down on the ground that's holding lines. This customer needs 2 fir trees basically chunked to the ground in a pretty tight area behind his house here. And he also needs the larger fir tree in the front there limbed up. So I'm kind of thinking about what gear I need to use to get this job done. I'm going to do the limbing first on this large fir tree here. So I chose the electric Husqvarna to get this done instead of using my 201T, my gas saw, because really all I'm doing is just some limbing. I don't need a ton of power, and it's nice to have that quiet electric saw to get this done. So when you're going up these larger fir trees, you could slingshot a line up in here and try an SRT climb up instead of doing what I'm doing, but I enjoy climbing these larger trees with lanyards. It's a lot more work really in the end, but you get up the tree a lot faster than having to try and go and get out your slingshot or trying to use a throw ball and get up here. And you can see how high I am. It'd be difficult to get a line up here by hand. You'd have to definitely use some sort of device to shoot it up into the first limb. But by the time I get all that set up, I'm already in the tree, ready to start working. So really, this is a much faster process for me. I don't normally use big shots or other devices to, launch throw balls up into the tree and then set up SRT systems. In some situations, it is more efficient to do that. And it's really just how you want to work. I enjoy the physical, effort that goes into spiking up these larger trees, so that's why I do it. If I was looking for an efficiency standpoint and less work, of course I would want to use an SRT climbing system and walk up the tree, but that's just not for me. It's not what I enjoy doing. So this is the process I take to limb trees out. So when you're approaching these limbs, you need to kind of think about, what do you want the limb to do? In this situation, you can see the house is pretty close to this tree, and if one of these limbs gets cut wrong, there's a good potential it will damage the house pretty significantly. These are large limbs, very heavy, so you don't want one of these things nose diving and then springing into the side of the house, and that happens. You need to always think in your mind, what is the limb going to do when it hits the ground? Is it going to nosedive? Is it going to hit butt first? How is it going to hit the ground? And then how will it act when it does hit the ground to avoid any sort of damage to structures, or even your guys on the ground that are working. If you're on a crew or something, you need to think about those things. So here I'm just reaching out and grabbing whatever I can that I know is not going to damage something on the ground, or if say one of these limbs does break off, it's not going to cause a significant amount of damage if something does happen. Instead, I'm just grabbing what I can that's small, like this here, by hand, and kind of guiding it to the ground. You could rig these things out on a rope if you had somebody on the ground. It's pretty fast, but really the fastest route is if you can just cut it and let it fall. But you have to really think about, how is it going to hit the ground again, like this limb here. I know how these are going to act when I'm putting the cuts in, whether they're just going to break or they're going to swing down against the trunk. And you'll see here in a minute, I'm going to cut some of these really large limbs, and I'm going to let them kind of peel down against the stem and then kick them over with my foot and then cut them the rest of the way off, to avoid having to try and strap these and deal with them by myself, because these are really large, they're heavy. I'm not going to be able to just cut it off and grab the limb and swing it. I got to do something else. Some of these are so big the straps don't even fit around the limb, so keep that in mind when you guys are buying your straps. Don't buy the smallest straps, the shortest lengths. Make sure you get some ones that are a little longer, because they can be used on bigger limbs as well as smaller limbs. So here I'm making a bottom cut and a top cut. The reason I'm doing this is I don't want that limb to peel down against the trunk. I want it to just break free right away. As soon as I make that top cut, I want it to break so I can push it out of the way. If it peels down against the stem and then nosedives into the ground, again, there's that potential it could, fling itself into the side of the house. So think about what you're doing. Here's another one. I'm putting a face cut in here. I'm using 2 straps, pretty simple. You don't have to use 2 carabiners, just use a strap on the left side or right side, and 1 carabiner works just fine. Now I cut that limb off. There's no way I could grab that by hand, it's too heavy. So now I can just use my double rope system above me and kind of rappel down, use my foot to push the limb around the tree, and then cut the limb off. I do this all the time when I'm by myself and I don't have anybody to hold a line. I'll use carabiners like that and just some straps to get these large limbs sectioned down into 2 or 3 different pieces, and it allows you to get some really big limbs onto the ground right where you want them to be by yourself. So you can see there, I was just using my leg to kick that thing around and then cut it off. And then I come up and just undo my strap and throw the limb to the ground. Okay, another way of doing this is if you had to go up this tree and limb a lot on it, is to set like a rigging line and then use some Prusik hitches or something in that line that you can slide up and down. And you can basically set it up to where you can cut 2, 3 or more limbs onto that rigging line where they flop down against the stem, and then you can rappel down and cut those in sections so you don't have to keep going up and down the tree for each limb. Now you're working on 2 or 3 limbs instead of 1. Here I'm kind of transitioning over to one of the trees that has to be chunked down. Instead of going back down to the ground and then having to climb all the way back up 50, 60 feet, I decided to just move over into this tree and go ahead and top it. There's some pros and cons to doing it this way. One of the cons would be that any limbs you take down from the top are going to strike other limbs on the way down, and that can actually be kind of risky in that those limbs can deflect on limbs below it and shoot them off in directions you don't want them to go. So you have to think about that. Do you want to limb it up from the bottom all the way to the top, then top the tree and come back down? Or can you get away with it like I'm doing here, where I'm getting a bunch of work done without having to climb an additional 60 feet? So I've pretty much gotten to the point where my T540 is not going to cut much more. So I went down to the ground, grabbed my 201T, and now I got to head back up to get this thing done. I'll have a little more power now to chunk these trees down. This is where having someone on the ground with the rigging line to where you can, haul saws up and down saves you a lot of work. But unfortunately by yourself, that's not going to be an option for you. So now I'm just going back up this tree, and I'm going to start, limbing this one from the bottom up. I'm going to top it, and then I'm going to go ahead and grab a little bit bigger of a saw, something like a 261 or 562, something not too heavy, but will give me a little more power to chunk it down. If you notice here in a second, I'm limbing this tree out, but you'll see me tap my saw against the side of the tree. See that? I'm doing that to stop the chain. You don't want to be up here going so fast as you're limbing that you forget that your chain is still running around that bar, and you go and put it to your side, or maybe you cross one of your arms in front of that chain, and then you end up getting cut real bad. So use the tree itself to stop that chain. So try that out while you guys are up there limbing. Just tap the tree every time you're about to swing that saw to your side, and that'll stop it, and then you're safe, right? Here I'm just taking a face out, doing a quick back cut, and pushing this tree over. So now you can start chunking this tree down from the top down, which is actually pretty nice. I can toss these pieces exactly where I want them to go. There is a huge benefit to doing this time saving wise. If you know where your landing zone is, it's a lot easier to just do it this way because you're cutting clean wood. These sections aren't hitting the ground, and then you have to cut them down there on the ground where it's wet and muddy and dirty, and you're tearing your chains up. Instead, you just, you're always in clean wood up here, so your chain's going to stay nice and sharp. There's times where this might not be as fast as cutting large sections out, but for this job, it worked really well. Now I'm switching over to my Husqvarna 562. There's definitely a limit to the 201T or the T540 where, you're really just not making much progress and you need to go and get a bigger saw. So you'll see me kind of put the saw in the top there, and as it's kind of like a placeholder for it. That works really well, so you don't have to put the saw down to your side every single time you go down a section. Just put the saw into the tree itself, and you can actually use it, especially when you're really tired, your legs are hurting you. You can use the saw as kind of a brace like that. You'll see me pushing down on the saw. I'm using it to take pressure off of my legs as I go down another one or two sections. So try that out. It saves you a lot of energy, especially when you're running big saws like a 90cc saw. You don't want to have to throw that on your side and then, climb down 2 or 3 feet. Just put it right back in the tree, use it as a brace, climb down a bit, and then you don't ever have to have that weight on your side. So as you're chunking trees down into firewood rounds, it works pretty good with rounds about the size of what I'm working on here. But as soon as you start getting into really heavy rounds, it starts to kind of break down. This way doesn't work very well. Your saw will get pinched in each round. So that's where you can do like a snap cut, come in the front and then in the back, offset it by maybe an inch or so vertically, and you can snap the piece off. Or you just start making face cuts and, cut 3 or 4 firewood rounds at a time, like a log section, and tip those over instead of trying to fight with each piece. But in this case, it's super fast for me to just keep going down and chunking one firewood round at a time and pushing it off. So once I got the main stem chunked down, I'm just on the ground now, just putting in a face cut and tipping this tree over. So there's not any major back lean or side leans on this, so you don't have to, go crazy with a really deep face cut or a shallow one. It's all dependent on how the stem is. This one's pretty vertical, so I just need to put in a normal face cut, kind of doing a Humboldt here. And I'll knock that face out and then just come in for a back cut to tip over this section, instead of trying to continue chunking it down one firewood round at a time. That's pretty slow once you get to this size of stem, you're better off just dropping the whole thing over. But to mitigate the risk, why cut some large log section when you're right next to a house? There's just really no point in doing that. I mean, it's just risky. You're better off chunking the tree down to a point where if something does go wrong, it's not going to be a real big deal. Damage will be minimal. Whereas if you're trying to cut a 20-30 foot section out of this, right next to the house, plus there's some stuff on the ground down this slope that could be damaged. He's got a canopy for his truck. It's not worth it to me. So I got to this point knowing that when I put these cuts in on the ground, there's nothing that can really go wrong. So we pretty much finished up chunking those trees to the ground. I didn't want to keep filming that because it's just the same process over and over again. Now we're over here cutting one last tree. It's an alder tree. It's basically leaned out over their water supply that was damaged, a year or two ago by a tree that came down on it. So they didn't want to have to repair that again. It was many thousands of dollars. So we're basically here to kind of evaluate, figure out how we could follow this thing. You can see the water supply where I'm pointing there. And there's also a creek that we're not wanting to put the tree in. So it's leaned hard out to the right. The whole top is. If I were to just put a face and back cut in that tree, it would definitely be on that water supply. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to clear around the tree so there's no tripping hazards. And I'm going to put a scissor wheel in this tree and try and spin it out to the left away from where it's leaned. So this is one of those trees that, you want to take your time on. You don't want to be flying through your face and back cut. There's too much at risk. If I make a mistake, that tree is going to be over there on the water supply and cause many thousands of dollars in damage. So I'm going to take an extra minute or so and just kind of slow down and make sure everything's right before I start trying to wedge this tree over. So scissor wheel here, I'm tearing away all the moss. You want to be able to see exactly where your back cut is starting and ending. The moss and other things like, really thick gnarled bark like on fir trees, you want to rip that away or chop it away so you can be very precise about where you're putting your cuts. You don't want your vision obstructed because you'll end up cutting that hinge off by accident and there's no putting it back. Now you're going to be in trouble. So just tear it away. It's nice and clean now. I can see I'm taking out that piece there for the scissor wheel and just kind of cleaning it up in there. Now I'll come in for the back cut and I'm going to cut off, almost cut the entire low side of the tree off and keep this high side reserved for my thick hinge because that's the side you absolutely cannot cut off. If I were to cut off the high side closest to me, the tree would just break off and it would go right over there on that water supply. So see, I'm looking back and forth, checking my hinge, making sure everything's right, and I'm slowing down. Now as I approach the final hinge I want it to be, I'm going to go ahead and throw some wedges in it, but I'm just going slow. I'm looking up at the top for movement and not seeing anything right now, but I'm pretty close to a finished hinge and I don't want to keep cutting because the tree could fail and it could spin over my shoulder. So now we're starting the wedging process. I'm going to start with hard head wedges and start inserting some K&H wedges. To be honest, the hard heads are fantastic wedges, but they do not stack well whatsoever if you're trying to double your wedges up. Definitely use the K&H wedges. They're the best wedges out there for stacking and just overall falling use. The hard heads are nice to get a tree moving because they don't get damaged as bad when you're hitting them. But again, they just don't stack and they're not as useful, I think, as the K&H. So here's the tree starting to crack. You can see it starting to form a vertical crack there, all the pressure from the wedges, and it's starting to come over. That's it, guys. Appreciate you watching. Stay tuned for some more videos on tree work. I'm kind of healed up now from my ankle injury, and I should be back out there. So God bless, stay safe, and thanks for watching.